We made it. We made it to the last lecture of Unit 5. Woo-wee! This is a big unit. This is Unit 5, Lecture 10. It is all about language. There is a good chance that I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this in class, so make sure you're listening and taking good notes, and that you bring any questions to me because I might not be bringing them to you. Okay, not too many learning targets. I would give this a medium, a rating of a medium topic. It's not a huge part of the overall AP test. There's still a good handful of things to know, but I don't think it's terribly difficult. Language, spoken, written, or gestured word, the way we communicate meaning to ourselves and to others. So how do we bring information in through words, and how do we give them out, and including my hand gestures, they count. Okay, let's start with language structure. First of all, we have phonemes, smallest distinctive sound unit in a spoken language. So, and yeah, this should sound a little bit like phonics class, but bat, for example, has 3 phonemes. So b, et. Meanwhile, chat has 3, ch, at. So we're not talking about letter by letter. We're talking about the sounds, like how we break them into sound chunks. So I don't know if we look at some of these diagrams, like here, cook, O means oh. We don't say k, k. So it's how many sound units are in a word. And we also break words into morphemes. And these are the smallest units that you can break sounds down into, but they have to carry meaning as well. So for example, milk. You cannot break down ilk, because does not have a meaning of its own. So how can, it's also not syllables, be careful with that. How can we break down words so they still each hold meaning? So in pumpkin, you can break it down to pump and kin. Both of those still mean something separate. Unforgettable, unforgettable. Each of these standing alone has a meaning of its own. Okay, so putting that together, phonemes, we have about 40 in the English language, and our basic sounds that letters make, and morphemes are small units as well, but are things that actually hold meaning when taken into their chunks. We also have phrases, words, and sentences, but these are the 2 structures of our language that typically students don't already know about. Grammar, the rule of grammar, or the idea of grammar, is a system of rules in a language that enables us to communicate with and understand others. So grammar is broken down into 2 things, either syntax, which is probably what you think of when you think of grammar, but also semantics. Syntax is considered surface structure, and semantics is considered deep structure. So kind of a funny thought, the syntax of the sentence, Jack the Giant Killer. The syntax is like, yeah, that makes sense, Jack the Giant Killer. But the semantics, Jack the Giant Killer. Is he giant, or is Jack killing the giants? So that's where semantics comes into play against syntax. Or maybe stolen painting found by tree. The syntax makes sense, stolen painting found by tree, but the semantics of it doesn't really make sense. The stolen painting was found next to the tree, or the tree found the stolen painting. So semantics matters. And yes, we've heard the word semantics a couple times in this unit, and each time it represents meaning. Okay, syntax first though. It's the set of rules for combining words into grammatically sensible sentences. It's the surface structure. So if I say grammar, typically syntax is what you think of. You think of the order, like verbs coming after the subject, or in English, we think of adjectives coming before nouns, whereas in Spanish, it's reversed, that the noun comes before the adjective. So syntax is particular to each and every language throughout the world, but it's the rules for how we put words and sounds in order so it makes sense in a sentence or a paragraph. Meanwhile, semantics are the set of rules to derive the specific meaning you're going for. So just because something is grammatically sound, Jack the Giant Killer, doesn't mean it's conveying what you want it to. And so semantics, the set of rules to derive meaning from morphemes, words, and sentence, that's the deeper structure, where you put the emphasis, or where you might put commas or order. So it really does deliver the meaning that you're looking for. At the word level, An example would be adding ed to the word laugh. By adding ed, you're able to change the semantics of the word to go from laughing or laugh to now it happened in the past tense. So that is a semantic rule of grammar specific to a word. So it's a semantic rule because it affects the meaning of the word. How does language develop? Well, in children, native languages develop quite early. By 1 year old, we have typically learned about 3,000 words already. By the end of high school, you typically know about 60,000 words. It's crazy how much, once you get used to a language, how quickly we can learn new words. Comprehension, though, can outpace production. What we mean by that is that children can understand language faster than they can produce it themselves. So by 6 months, a child can recognize an object's name and maybe point. So if you say Dolly, Dolly, they can probably find their dolly. By 7 months, they can recognize word breaks and syllables. So if you want to say happy baby, they can often follow along that means happy baby. They don't necessarily think it's 4 different words. Now, what about the stages and stages of language development? The babbling stage is the first one. This is typically around 4 months, where you start to hear where babies actually can produce language or sounds, language like sounds like ah, cool, mama. Maybe not mama, that's actually a word, but just random sounds. It is not an imitation of adult speech, though. At that point, they're not actually copying, they're just experimenting with the sounds that they can make. By the time they hit approximately 9 or 10 months, you can start to tell whether or not the baby is making sounds for their native language. So perhaps if they're trying to make a J sound and they are in a German household, J actually makes a Y sound, so they might start saying Y, Y, instead of where English babies are going to say J, J. That might not be the best example, but long and short of it is that by 9 to 10 months, you can start to pick up what language is spoken in the baby's home. Next stage is the one-word stage, usually around 1 year old or so. Sometimes it's a little longer for some children. And children will start speaking one-word thoughts, just like doggy or like dolly. And what they mean, especially if they're including like pointing or looking at a certain location, that they say doggy, doggy, they could be meaning, look at the dog out there, adult, or go get me my doggy stuffed animal. And so they start to have these thoughts and can pick out maybe single words to try to convey that thought. They're also starting to be able to produce short consonant sounds like B, D, M, P, or T, like B, B, D, D, P, P, or T. Because all of those sounds, when you make those sounds, and even if you feel like an idiot, I suggest you do it, they mimic feeding motions. So your tongue, your lips, your teeth are copying motions similar to eating or perhaps sucking on a bottle. Typically at this stage, family members or people who are around that 1 year old often know what they're trying to convey, but maybe not other people. At the 2-word stage, we have telegraphic speech, where a child speaks like a telegram. And you might not know what a telegram is, but it was like a very, very, very early text message sent over telephone wires and clicked onto paper. And you would typically have to pay for each word, so people would make them as short as possible. So around 2, a child would speak like a telegram. Go car means I would like to go ride in a car. So short little sentences. And then longer phrases. By the time a child is in elementary school, I don't really have an exact age here, but children can put together longer phrases that actually follow the syntax or, those structural grammar rules, and it makes some sort of semantic sense. So synactical sense is kind of the added layer here. Mommy get ball, okay? You start to follow the rules, subject, verb, object, and it makes more sense to an adult's ear, to any adult's ear. These students, or these children rather, also start to understand humor, which is what's kind of fun about this age. You never starve in the desert because of all the sand which is there. So they start to comprehend language enough so that they see the double meanings and can understand the semantics, the deeper semantics of words as well. So now, how do we learn language? Well, just like a lot of other things in this unit, of course, it varies by the psychologist and their theories. So Skinner said, we learn languages through operant conditioning with rewards. The learning principles of association, imitation, and shaping all come into play. Like, we learn the word for dolly because enough people will say dolly while holding up a doll and shaking it or playing with it in front of the child. And so they associate the word dolly with the object. Mimicking or imitation of the adult, saying, say mama, mama, and then they say mama, and everyone goes, yay! So that's another reason why Skinner says people learn, or how people learn language. And then shaping. So ma, mama, yay! Mama and dada, yay! And mama and dada, love you. You know, those sorts of things. And then cheering or reinforcing or giving candy or giving toys or whatever to reinforce that language. And specifically getting really excited and giving reinforcement when the sounds that they're making are even close to what the adult is prompting. So that's Skinner's little nutshell. It makes sense and it fits right into everything we know about Skinner. Opposing Skinner is Chomsky, and he is one of two big names in language, in the development of language theory, and he believed that language is an inborn human trait, that like we're born with the ability, or our brains are designed, and I'll actually get to a term that supports this, but our brains are designed to learn languages, and it's super easy to learn languages that we experience as a child, so the ones that we're around and we hear often, which is why it tends to be easier for children to learn languages or even become a bilingual, where it's very difficult for adults because we get so trained in our ways that by the time we are, in our 20s, 30s, 40s, that part of our brain has kind of already been taken over, I guess, by the languages that we grew up around. And we don't need reinforcement. We don't need learning principles to learn language. He also developed this idea of universal grammar, that languages have a universal grammar that allows us to that underlies all world languages, and it allows us to understand each other even when someone is not speaking our native language to us. That if someone is attempting it and they can get close, then we can probably follow along. So if someone's speaking broken English, typically means they're using English words, but maybe in the wrong order. And Chomsky would say, well, there's something in languages that allow us to understand that, even if it doesn't follow the proper grammar rules. One example of an underlying universal rule is that children or maybe not one example, one piece of evidence, is that children have the tendency to overgeneralize or over-regularize. These words literally mean the same thing as far as I'm concerned. But they'll take some grammar rule that they learn and they apply it to other words, even if they're not taught how to properly. So for example, knowing that ED means past tense, a child might not be taught that properly, but still will start to say things like, I go to the store, because they learn what go is, and they pick up on the idea that ED means past tense. Or there are 20 childs in class, because they might not learn how to conjugate every other word, but they get, somewhere along the line, they get that S's make words plural. And then finally, the other piece of evidence that Chomsky said supports the idea that language is kind of natural is that we all have a language acquisition device, basically a neural network in our brain pre-programmed for understanding language. So maybe this is also evidence of Wernicke's area and Broca's area, that our brain is ready to receive language, ready to acquire language as soon as it is exposed. So that's why learning your native language is very, very easy, and then learning a foreign language later on is so much more difficult. Last theory on how we learn language is that of statistical learning. And it's not associated with a specific psychologist. However, it's the approach or the theory that humans process and learn language by detecting patterns and segments in language based on probability. In other words, When we hear certain sounds, maybe like an S and a T going together very, very often, then that might be something that a baby or a child learns very quickly because they can predict that that sound will be used in many words. To piggyback or to support this theory is the idea of a critical period. Now, I'm explaining critical period here in language, but it's going to apply to a lot of different things in our development unit as well. And the people who support statistical learning of language would say that language must be learned by, or at least a child must be exposed to language by age 7, or the window for learning language at all is going to close. And a child will not learn to, I don't know, speak at all, or at least will never really master their native language. So the definition of critical period in general is that if we don't learn on an important skill by a certain age, our likelihood of learning it is slim to none. So that's just the definition of critical period, but it's connected to this theory because the idea is that it applies to language in that if you don't learn language by age 7, you're not going to. Okay, one last little chunk here is language and thinking and how they're connected and which one influences which. Benjamin Whorf is the second of the two important names in this lecture, and he developed a theory of linguistic relativism. Sometimes it's regarded as linguistic determinism. There is a slight difference, but for our purpose, we're going to treat them as the same. And he claimed that language shapes the way we think and perceive the world. And he used the Hopi Native American tribe in Arizona to kind of demonstrate this idea. And it's that the Hopi don't have past tense for verbs, therefore they don't think readily about the past. So it's harder for them to articulate what happened long ago or reflect on it because they don't have language to go with it. Similarly, the Alaskan Eskimos have many different words for snow. It's part of their environment. And so I guess I don't know this for a fact, but perhaps all of their different words for snow pertain to the different types of snow and things like that. But the idea with linguistic relativism is that our language influences the way we think and the things that we need to describe. So one more example, perhaps a child would never describe themselves as being jealous of their friend having an awesome new toy. They just take it because they don't understand, they don't know the word jealous, and they don't understand the word jealous. And so the words we know influence our thinking. This is just a cartoon about many different words for coffee. In an experiment to demonstrate this point, several groups of people were given these 3 pictures and asked to put them in a certain order. English speakers arranged them, the banana in its peel, partially peeled and half eaten from left to right because that's how we read. Language influencing our concept of time. Meanwhile, Hebrew speakers laid them out from right to left because Hebrew is written from right to left. So language influencing our way of thinking. One other fun fact in relation to this, in cultures with languages that read from left to right, like English, about 2/3 of couples will lean their heads to the right when they want to kiss. So perhaps there's some sort of connection there. 77% of Hebrew and Arabic language speakers who read from right to left kiss by tilting their heads to the left. Interesting, huh? A few other points about how language affects our thoughts. The idea that having a language for things allows us to think about and retain ideas more clearly supports the need to be more gender neutral with certain words. It is easier to think of a police officer as a man, not a woman, because we're so used to saying policeman. So if we get more comfortable with words like a flight attendant or police officer and so on, then it starts to eliminate some of those gender biases in those careers. So again, the language we use influences the way we think about those concepts. And to wrap up our connection from language and thinking, or between language and thinking, thinking is language-based, but we also think in images. And so while we might think to ourselves or even talk to ourselves sometimes to flesh out our thoughts, we can also picture going for the winning goal or baking our favorite cookies. And why is this important? Well, in the brain, imagining an activity activates the same regions as when performing the activity. So this is like a mirror neuron. So most psychologists believe that thoughts and languages go hand in hand. So as we think of going for that goal or making that cookie, and we picture it in our mind, it activates just like if we were to really do it. It kind of means that, I guess what the conclusion is that the visual represents that activity just like the language does. I don't know that made a whole lot of sense, but yeah. Okay, that's it.